I'm at Iowa State University. I've been working in the diagnostic lab there since about 1990. My area is mostly research. I do research on swine diseases, and in particular I've done quite a bit of work on PRRS since that time, since I got hired.
Good. The farm.
We have very good tools for defining the PRRS status of a farm. In particular, we've been working on surveillance techniques, which makes it possible for using either antibody-based assays like an ELISA or nucleic acid detection-based assays like PCRs to look at PRRS status, not only the farm but also of locations within the farm, buildings or spaces.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The most important part, of course, in terms of a PRRS control program is to look at productivity, both in terms of average daily gain, for example, but also in terms of morbidity, mortality. We do have good diagnostic tools for monitoring control programs, again using surveillance based on either antibody detection or PCRs. Okay, PRRS ELISA results can be interpreted in terms of SP values. SP values tend to respond in terms of the antigenic load, so they go higher the more antigenic exposure pigs have. At the same time, you don't want to over-interpret SP values. Some people are inclined to do that. But you can use, for example, SPC charting to look and see how SP values change in populations over time.
Good.
ELISAs, the use of ELISA for vaccine efficacy isn't probably a very pragmatic approach. If you think about the definition of vaccine efficacy is defined as a reduction in the incidence or the cases over time. So efficacious vaccines should reduce the incidence of a disease. The advantages of using oral fluid-based surveillance, and that is collecting oral fluid samples from spaces, from buildings, from pens over time. The advantages is that using either antibody-based assays, using either ELISAs or PCRs, you really get a good sense of the circulation of PRRS virus in those populations. So the advantage is an easy sample to collect, a fairly cheap sample to process or test, and it gives you a very dynamic picture of virus circulation in populations. Probably the single disadvantage that I can think of in terms of oral fluids is the fact that you lose some precision. In other words, if you have samples from individual animals, you're able to make very precise estimations of what's happening at that individual pig level. But in general, we're looking at the herd level, we're looking at the population level, and so that disadvantage, or that advantage, certainly becomes a disadvantage very quickly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the relevance of oral fluid-based surveillance are immediate. In other words, they're telling you exactly what's happening in a population, in a building, in a pen, at that moment and over time. If you use periodic sampling, you then end up with essentially a movie of what's happened in that population over time. And at the end of that period, of that group of animals, you can see what happened and how it impacted their final performance. The evolution of oral fluids in the USA for swine, because they have a much longer history of use on the human side, but in swine, we initially began our research in 2005. By 2005, we had enough confidence that we began actually running oral fluid-based testing at the laboratory at Iowa State University. And so that was in February of 2010. Every year we've seen an increase in the number of tests we run. So this year we'll run about 130,000 tests. So we've seen the process taken up by producers and veterinarians. They like it. They're using it more and more extensively, and we think that they'll continue to do so. Actually, in our group, we've done quite a bit of work with aerosols, PRRS aerosols in particular, but with a few other pathogens as well. If you look at aerosols, they're quite complex, and so since aerosols and pathogens in aerosols are not distributed uniformly, it's going to be a problem, I think, in terms of using aerosols as a method to diagnose PRRS outbreaks in barns. It depends on quite a number of factors. For example, if you have a barn with curtains or without sides, as you see in the tropics, you have a much different probability of detection as opposed to in northern climates where you have very tight buildings. And so I don't have a very optimistic viewpoint of aerosol sampling as a method to diagnose PRRS outbreaks.